says we're on hold for 2 years, and they may be, but we're not. Okay? We're not stopping until we get a final fix on this. We don't want this fight to go on forever. Okay? And I said, as you can see, we've learned our lesson from last meeting. We've got a big venue, and I hope we still get quite a few people coming in. So I want to thank South Kitsap High School for allowing us to come in here and do this. We have, if you don't see her running around, we got one of the custodians that we're pointing fingers at, and she's helping us out, but she's in behind the curtain back there, so nobody ever sees her. I would also like to thank Commissioner Orrin Rudd. He's not here tonight, or today. However, he made a couple of comments that says, I want to work with you, and I believe him. And one of the things that our group doesn't want to do is be combative. We want to work with the county and hopefully together to get a solution for all of this. And so, again, I want to shout out to him. Secondly, I don't know if Charlotte Garrido's here in the group at all, but shout to her because before she was even a commissioner, she was sent on the commission to help establish this forest, and she fought a good fight all the way through. And she's retired now, but she still keeps her hand in the mix. So, and lastly, we're working hand in hand with the Reverend Sportsman's Club. They've donated a lot to us and helped us out. Where's Ron Forbes at? Ron, you want to stand up here and give him a shout? And he's helping us a bunch, so we really appreciate that. And lastly, I want to thank everybody in the community. And I see so much on the internet of, geez, thank you, Mike, thank you, Charlene, thank everybody. Well, we're just a handful of folks. And you're the people that are writing the commissioner, writing the county, and telling them what you think. And so we can't do it without you, and so give yourself a round of applause for that. Okay, just a quick note, and one that we're really proud of. This group is now a 501c3 and registered. So that's a big happy to the people who made that happen. Patty Weibel, Sonny, Charlene, Carrie, a few people besides me. I didn't touch it because I have no idea how to set one up. So I'm just giving the kudos where it belongs. Okay, it's been a long 6 months. I got to put a step away from this mic. It's been a long 6 months since we started this, and nothing more than to save a small tract of land of 635 acres. If you don't know, I've been involved with Banner for almost 50 years, maybe a little bit more, and we're still going at it. And geez, I wish I could just sit down and say we're done, but we're not. So we're going on from there. And what we thought would last 100 years. Without any fight, it just seems like we just keep going and going and going. We didn't ask for any playgrounds. We didn't ask for ball fields or any blacktop paths. Anything that would take away from the potential beauty of this park. All we asked for is a chance to nurture it and become a patch of woods to hold your kid's hand and just go for a walk in the woods. Take your dog for a walk. If nothing else, just relax. That park was taken care of by a group of stewards. Nobody got paid. All the kiosks, all the seats, the paths that were cleared, the brush that was cleared, supplies were all donated. It was donated by the community. The county didn't really put a lot of money into it because the county doesn't have a lot of money. So we did a lot of begging and a lot of pushing and shoving, and people came together and they made that park what it is. Okay, we took pride in ownership, slowly turned it into what you see today. Okay, okay, that forest is a natural classroom, and if you didn't know it, South Kitsap brings their school kids up here to study that park. The cross-country team uses that park. The search and rescue uses that park. The veterans suffering from PTSD use that park. And again, the senior citizens use it. Every single person in here, and almost, I'd say, close to 6,000 people have signed up and say, I use it too. That doesn't include people that haven't even mentioned anything. We go up into the park and we see people that say, geez, I didn't know what was even going on. And that's a daily basis. So there's a lot of folks out there. Okay? Anyway, in short, and I'm going to cut this short because I've got a guy right behind me that really needs to do the speaking and not me. So anyway, in this fight we've learned a lot. We've met a lot of individuals that believe as we do. The natural regeneration and minimal intervention is the way to make this forest work. Sometimes it butts heads and it flies right in the face of what Kitsap County would like to do to it. And so that's what we're fighting against. The gentleman behind me, Dr. Dominic Dallasala, and our group spent all day yesterday through the park. And he took a lot of notes, and we made some slideshows, and that's what we're going to present today. And if I don't do this, he won't, because I think he's a little bit on the modest side in what he's accomplished in his lifetime and what he does. So I'm going to take this. I'm going to take this right off the internet. So it says it well. Dr. Dominic B. Dallasala has worked for several nonprofit conservation organizations for over 40 years as a global biodiversity and climate change scientist, while also serving as president of the Society for Conservation Biology, the North American section. He's internationally renowned author of over 300 peer-reviewed articles and 9 co-authored award-winning books, including Temperate and Boreal Rainforests of the World, Ecology and Conservation, Mixed Severity Fire, Nature's Phoenix and Conservation, Science and Advocacy for the Planet in Peril, Speaking Truth to Power. Dominic has given keynote talks ranging from academic conferences to the United Nations, or other United Nations, in Earth Summit 2. He has appeared in National Geographic, Science Digest, Science Magazine, Time Magazine, Audubon Magazine, National Wildlife Magazine, High Country News, Terrain Magazine, New York Times, LA Times, US Times, the Jim Lehrer NewsHour, CNN, MSNBC, and several PBS documentaries. He's testified as an expert witness at numerous congressional hearings in defense of the Endangered Species Act, roadless areas, national monuments, old forest protections, and climate change remediation, amongst many others. So, when somebody asks us, just who on earth is your expert? And why are you telling us these things? Okay, we got one. And he's really good. And he's donating his time to come up and talk to you. So without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Dominic Dallasala.
I hate podiums. I'm just going to move away from that. You guys with the cameras, let me know if I'm moving off of your field of vision. Well, good afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing? All right. I've got 2 really important questions to ask. And before we turn the lights off, I want to make sure everybody gets their exercise, okay? So stand up if you love the Banner Forest. And if you can't stand, just raise your hand, okay? Gotcha. Okay, please sit down. Gotcha one more time. Stand up if you are a Seattle Seahawks fan rooting for the team. Uh-oh, we got some LA fans in here. Uh-oh. Well, fear not. I am a New York Jets fan. Yeah. The last time they won the Super Bowl, man was on the moon. Think about that, right? So I'm a suffering Jets fan. I grew up in New York and in Brooklyn, so forget about it. And I've been working in some of the most biodiverse forests on the planet since my early 20s. So I'm kind of in the sunset of my career. I parachute into these incredible places, these forests, and learn about them as much as I can. And then we work with communities to see about what the conservation needs are. And I started my career doing what we call bioblitzes. They would literally take teams of scientists like myself, put us into certain areas and say, okay, there's your transect, walk that line and count as many species as you can, as fast as you can, to inventory the biodiversity in these places because they're going away so fast. And so yesterday I had the pleasure of being on the ground in your park. I spent the entire day walking most of the trails, doing kind of this mental inventory of what I was seeing out there that I hope will help inform you today in terms of what some options might be. And because I had you guys get up twice, I promise this is going to be about the Banner Forest, and there's going to be some Seahawks stuff in here too. Not to disappoint. So anyway, I am an expert in forest ecosystems globally. I've worked many, many years in the Pacific Northwest, but yesterday was my first experience in Banner Heritage Forest Park. And so I was brought in to just assess the situation. I did talk to the county before I arrived here. They were kind enough to give me their time. We did a Zoom call, so I got their perspective. I got this perspective from the friends groups that shepherded me around yesterday. We had a drone with us as well, so we got some drone footage. And we just did some basic ecology and basic walking around Banner Forest. So I got a really good thumbnail perspective of something that you guys already know, because you live and you love this special place. So I'll share with you my perspective as a forest ecologist looking in this very short period of time that I had, and also reading the documents, and speed reading the documents, because it was like a fire hose of information in a very short period of time, so I can interpret what some of the alternatives or options may be that you all want and the county wants. So that's really kind of the focus of my talk today, and I want to thank everybody again for turning out in such great numbers. And now's the time to turn the lights down and get the slides going. You guys already had your exercise, so no sleeping while this is going on, okay? Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Okay, so one of the areas of my research is to distinguish between what is restoration and what is forest degradation. We use the word restoration a lot, but you really got to define and understand what you mean in contrast to an area that has been degraded. So a good chunk of my presentation today is going to focus on giving you all the tools to know what the difference is so that you can be more effectively communicating what you want with the county, and vice versa. I hope to have a conversation with the county. We already talked about doing that after my visit to also get their perspective in the context of what you're going to see today. And Carrie is my lovely slide advancer, so thank you, Carrie, for going forward with the next slide. Okay, so I spent almost a half a century of my life working in forest ecosystems around the globe. And it really comes down to in a nutshell, why forests are so important on the globe. And this applies to you guys too. Over 50% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, plants, wildlife, are found in forests. It's a lot of biodiversity to be inventorying, which is what my teams and I have been doing over that almost half a century. In addition, forests have this kind of basket of ecosystem benefits that we get. They give us air filtration as the lungs of the planet. They give us and purify our water. as cooling towers. They are involved in climate regulation as climate sanctuaries. Think about taking a walk in Banner Forest on a hot July day, and you step out of your cars, a very hot area, and you go into that forest. It's like being in outdoor air conditioning. The trees are giving you that cooling effect that we get from having an intact forest canopy. When you remove that canopy, now you got all that sunlight, you got that heat, you got that drying hitting the ground, and you lose that buffering capacity. So really important for climate regulation. There have been indigenous connections in these forests for millennia, and those are quite important to a lot of the tribal relations with these forests. There's the spiritual connection that many people have when they go into a forest and they feel different about things. It's a good way to decompress from the surroundings. There's the recreational biking that I saw, the horseback riding, the hiking, the dogs, and people walking. It was just a lovely day, and that's where you go. Recreation, right? Medicinal plants, mushrooms, lots of other benefiting plants that are derived from forests, and there's also timber valleys. So that's the basket of ecosystem benefits that we get out of these forests. The more intact the forest is, the more the benefits are. So if a forest is degraded, it has fewer benefits. Next slide. Unfortunately, we have lost about half of the world's forests in my lifetime, mostly in my lifetime. And that chart you see there is a rolling average of tropical forest loss over a 2-decade period. It's been ongoing, despite global efforts to slow it down. And I can give you the number there. It's 22,000 acres every hour of every day is lost in the world's tropics. Or we can convert that over to soccer fields. I was just watching a soccer game outside over there. The equivalent of over 7,000 soccer fields of deforestation in the tropics every hour of every day. It's a lot of forest loss. Now in the United States, my team has inventoried about 10% of our forests are considered mature and old growth. The rest had a heavy managed influence. So that's not a lot, but it's still incredibly important in the U.S. Next slide. So there are a number of international fora that I've been involved in to try to slow global forest loss. And one of them is called the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that framework has a goal of protecting 30% of the world's forests by 2030. It's called 30 by 30. Only 14% is currently protected, so it's about a doubling within, 4 years left? That goal was set up in 2015. There's also a restoration goal of restoring about 864 million acres by 2030. And then there was a New York Declaration that was signed by 162 countries in 2015 to end deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. Those are really great, lofty, important goals. And it's happening on a global scale, and it's a place where all communities can plug in through contributions at the local level. So what might the contribution be for the Banner heritage forests in the context of those global goals? We can take a look at that as we get through the rest of the presentation, but it's just keep in mind, you guys are operating locally, but this is happening all over the world. Every place that I go gives me strength, gives me hope for a sustainable future because of what I see at the local level, and then I can carry it forward to the global level. Next slide. So I like to start presentations with definitions, so we know what we're all talking about. It's really important to understand terms. This is the way, language is the way we communicate, and to have effective communication, we need to be talking the same language. So let's start with, what do we mean by deforestation? The slide there is tropical deforestation. You can see the difference on one side of the road versus the other. It's a permanent change in forest cover. You convert it over to agriculture, you grow cows on it, or you put pavement on there. That's deforestation. It's most prevalent in the tropics because the forests, once they're cut down like this, they don't come back. Next slide. Then there is forest degradation, because remember we had that global goal, halt deforestation and degradation by 2030. What is degradation? So degradation in most scientific studies is the reduction of ecological integrity as compared to a reference site. What is ecological integrity? Something that has integrity has all the parts present, right? That's acting in integrity, you're acting with all your parts present in a forest. The integrity can be measured on the ground by the number of native species that should be there, whether the forest is working the way it should be working, it's functioning properly, and whether all the processes are in place, whether it's wildfires in the dry forest, whether it's tree fold gaps in the wet forest. Those processes of cycling nutrients, they're all working together. That's a forest of high integrity. So you start with a forest of high integrity on your reference site, you see on the right of that, and then you can look at that in context of different management treatments in terms of how far removed you are from the reference site as to whether or not you're doing restoration or degradation. That's how we measure these things. And we can take it out on the ground with a checklist with all these variables that we look at: soil compaction, invasive species, wildlife, just kind of go through a checklist. Reference condition, areas that we've treated, is that degradation or restoration? So we can do this. There are metrics for doing this on the ground. Next slide. One of the biggest impacts on landscapes is roads. And in the U.S., on national forests, there are over 380,000 miles of roads, which is enough to drive around the circumference of the planet 16 times. And that's one of the biggest degradation factors on forests, at least in our forest systems. And it also brings with it the possibility of unwanted fire emissions. So roads are a bad thing on the landscape. They're great for getting around, they're great for access, but you have to scratch your head, do we really need that many roads? So it's just one thing to consider in terms of measuring degradation. Roads are part of that metric. Next slide. Okay, so you guys are right there, that little green spot, right in the center left, the Banner Forest. Now watch this little trick we're going to pull here, Carrie's going to help me with. Global Forest Watch has been tracking forest degradation on a global scale. We'll give Carrie a second or two here to pull up a different screen, and I want to show you what's been happening on the peninsula over the last 2 decades. So what you're going to see on the screen here is, hold on, Carrie, could you get that little right thingy off of there, where it says project? Yeah, that's it. So, nice shot of a horse there. So the blue that you see, those blue dots, those are forests that are growing back. The red that you see there, those are forests that have been clear cut. So we're going to take you back in time to 2020, what is it? Yeah, and we're going to advance this 2 decades. Watch the color change on the screen. Okay, so we just went ahead 2 decades. Kerry, can you point on the screen where you guys are located, please? Okay, can everybody see that little hand? Just kind of swirl it around. There you go. That's what you guys are. Can you click it again from the beginning? Now pay attention to that spot, because this is your backyard. Watch it change over 2 decades. Look at what happened to the peninsula. Look at Northern Oregon. I can see why you guys love your forests, because so much of the surroundings have been changing. Thanks, Gary. Give her a second. We can flip back on to the other part of the screen. So a lot of degradation that's been happening in the surroundings. There's that nice horse again. I think we were on slide 8. Anybody busy yet? Here we go. Thank you, Terry. Next slide. Okay, so that's kind of a snapshot. You guys are in an oasis in a sea of development. So I definitely can see why you love your forest, because this is the sanctuary for people, for wildlife, and all the things that we value in the surroundings that have been intensively developed and are going to continue to be developed as more and more people move here. Next slide. Okay, so I had some time to read through the county's forest planning documents. I spent a little bit of time, and I'm going to extract language from those documents so we know what we're talking about, and we can kind of tease it apart to see how that's playing out on the ground. So some really good statements in these documents. The Banff Forest Management Plan is set up for a vision that's focused on education, habitat, public use, and recreational activity. Those are really good guiding mechanisms for developing a forest management plan. But the forestry that's being proposed needs to be consistent with those overall goals, which have been set forth for the forest that you love. Next slide. Tease it apart a little bit more. I started to think about this notion of a heritage park. What does that mean? And I kept scanning the documents and scanning them, and I couldn't find a definition of what is heritage. But I found some in the dictionary, something that's handed down from the past as a tradition, a legacy, something that has been inherited is a heritage. The 7 generations concept of Native American people. This was mentioned by the county government as well in my phone call. They're thinking 7 generations. Large trees, old trees are heritage elements. But what really does it mean? It's something that I struggled with because I couldn't find really clear definitions in the documents. So it's something to think about, because I'll wrap up on that later on. But I'm just flagging it now as a missing component. And then I started to look at the plans, and I started to pull information out, my discussion with the Kitsap County folks. They mentioned that 13 of the 75 parks are focal areas with about 9,500 acres of forest. In the Banff Forest, they were proposing that amount of thinning that you see up there. We'll talk about that. And they talk a lot about desired future conditions, where they want to move the forest from where it is now to where they would like it to go over time. And to do that, they're talking about treatments that would remove, in places, up to half of the trees, leaving 8 large, 8 medium, and 2 large snags per acre. So those were that's some of the information I was able to extract from the documents, taking no trees greater than 24 inches DBH, diameter crest height, But when I was doing my walk through the field yesterday, I didn't see a lot of trees above 24 inches diameter. So that's a pretty upper bound limit on thinning. Because when you don't have a lot of trees that big to begin with, it doesn't really mean much to have a cap set that high up on what you can't take in thinning. The road system, it was hard to get from the forest plan how much they're going to open. And we've already talked about how roads are degrading and not restoration. And then the good part of it is they're focused on these desired future conditions to increase structural complexity. That's good. That's a good thing. How you do it, though, is a matter of perspective that we'll talk about. Next slide. Then I look for language, because again, we keep coming back to language. What do they mean? What's the definition? They use in their documents in several areas: health, forest health, healthy ecosystems, healthy communities. What does that mean, right? And we're going to talk about that as well. And then they get into this thing about prescriptions. It's like you went to a doctor and you got prescribed because you were feeling sick. The forest is unhealthy. We have to prescribe a treatment. It's a very kind of medical-focused language, depending on your interpretation of what health is. Is it unhealthy? Is it sick? Or is it just being what it's supposed to be? Their restoration, got some good statements in there. I like some of this. They talk about departure from desired conditions. And they talk about guided by historical conditions and, kind of mixing in the past and future climate. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But again, what does it mean to be departed from desired conditions if you don't have a reference site? I don't see any information on reference sites. I do see a notion of backcasting to an historical time period, but I still don't see a reference. What's the reference area that has high integrity, that you're trying to restore something that has been degraded to a higher integrity state? That's missing. Next. More language in there that's got some good elements to it. You can question, what does resilience mean? We're doing stewardship and restoration to achieve resilience. What is that? Right? What is that in practice? I know what it is ecologically, but what does it mean in practice? High quality habitats, yeah, good one. Refugia, and as forests get older, they become more of a refuge, a sanctuary for all those values, those basket of ecosystem benefits that I laid out earlier. The older the trees are, the older the forests are, the more they accrue those benefits. That's refugia, especially in a changing climate when everything else is warming up and drying in the surroundings. This is a big one. I get this a lot. In fact, I've been testifying in front of congressional committees now for over 30 years about this term, forest health. What the heck does it mean? How do you know if a forest is sick or healthy? They list that they've got a bunch of small trees in the parks. They don't have enough large trees yet. Okay, but is that unhealthy? They also talk about the need to boost tree vigor and tree growth. That sounds like a very forestry kind of minded approach. We can talk a little bit about that. But a lot of this is based on health. Okay, and those two slides that you see on the upper and the lower right, my right, this side, the top one looked pretty darn healthy to me on most of the field walks that I was doing yesterday. The bottom one, those young stands, okay, there's something going on in there. We can talk about that. And I'm going to pick this apart as we go through the slides. Next one, please. This is all county language, by the way. So in my walk yesterday, I went from the south to the north gate. You guys know where all these places are. I've listed them all. And it was my 6-hour tour through the park. and try to gather as much information like one of those early bio blitzes 40 years ago. I was just soaking it all up on a beautiful winter day in your park. I didn't see much evidence of an unhealthy forest. I saw a forest that was doing what it's supposed to do. Yeah. I saw some examples of really cool stuff, like that tree on my left now, looking this way. You see some pitch there. It's kind of like a bluish gray. And, you know, it's probably a beetle in there causing the tree to defend itself. That's how these trees defend themselves. They pitch. And so when the beetle lands on that, it's like flypaper. It's not getting off of that sap. So that's a healthy response to an insect that's trying to get in there, and the tree is responding the way nature designed it. I didn't see that much of this going on. Now, if you get to a point where a lot of trees are doing this, you could say, yeah, okay, it might be in the beginning phase of an outbreak. I didn't see that. All the places that I walked around yesterday. I did see a little bit of canopy kill. You can see it on this side. Those upper trees with the white tops look to me like they may have had some pine beetle in them. But it was really localized. There weren't a lot of places where I was able to see that. And I was looking intently for this all throughout my trip yesterday. So these kind of mid-zero, these mid-age forests, they looked like what they're supposed to look like. There was no health crisis that I was able to see in those mid-forest stages. So really, the whole healthy forest thing to me was meaningless because I didn't see it. Next one. Okay. I encounter this problem all the time. How can there be more than one truth? In the case of the Bannock Forest, the perspectives of how you look at the forest really determine what your truth is. So you can have one truth that says, hey, the forest is overstocked and needs restoration, including some commercial removals. Or you can have the flip side of that. It looks pretty healthy to me. I don't think it needs any major intervention. And now we have dueling perspectives. Looking at the exact same piece of land with this difference in perspectives. It's happened every single time I've been on walks through the forest with foresters and wildlife people and decision makers, all looking at the same thing. Imagine putting on a pair of sunglasses and looking at the same scene, and half the people see it in blue, and half the people see it in red, but the same object. They're looking at the same object, but they're seeing it in different colors. That's what's going on. It depends on what your value system is, how you see the forest, and therefore how you react to whether it's a problem of unhealthy or whether it's beautiful and just doing its own thing. And if it's unhealthy, it needs active management. And if it's doing its own thing, nature knows what it's doing, right? And no one trusts anyone. That's where you guys are. You're right smack in the middle of that with the county parks. How do we break loose of that? And we'll talk about that later. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to return to this. It's a publication that I did with about 12 other people around the world working on forest ecosystems pretty much all over the planet. We wanted to figure out how do we know if it's restoration or degradation. I'm going to return to a reference site, an area that is working the way nature designed it. Native species, everything functioning right, the structures in place, high integrity. Then you move that system to a different state through management. Is it restoration or degradation? And it's a gradient. On that little bar, you see that multicolored bar. High integrity is green, low integrity is red. And you can approach tipping points where you have degraded the system so much it functions like it's been deforested. Where you remove so many trees, like you see that slide on my right again, that it really is not functioning as a forest anymore. That's extreme degradation. Again, we know how to measure this. We can take a checklist out in the forest and we can start checking off boxes. Native species present, intact forest canopy, and so on. We can give it a scoring and then compare that to an area that has been managed to determine is it restoration or degradation. And I saw a lot of that yesterday. Next. So you have to have a reference site. So when I was growing up as an undergrad, I took some of my first forest ecology classes, and we learned that forests go through changes over time. It's called forest succession. And we were taught that it's a linear process, going from pioneer stage to old growth. That's where you see that horizontal arrow over there. I've now been writing articles with colleagues. It's not linear. It's circular. And it's all connected in the forest. So you can have an old growth forest that is at the later stage of succession with a treefold gap. Inside that gap are pioneer organisms, all racing to come up to the light, the early stage of forest development at the level of a treefold gap inside an old growth forest. So old growth connected to young growth inside the same stand is circular succession. And it changes your perspective if you're trying to push the system forward and forward and forward in time, when in fact it just wants to be circular. That it's going to have natural disturbances inside old forests. And it's going to continue to go around this circle. This is going to go on and on and on, regardless of our intervention. So we have to rewrite the textbooks that these successional changes are circular and they're all connected. Next. Okay, so here's my ChatGPT assisted graphic. So that chart you see on this side has time on the y-axis and successional stage on the x-axis. So I'm going to relate this to what I saw yesterday. So if you are on that left side, early successional, which is where that vertical arrow is on a lot of the stands that I saw yesterday, you might want to do some assisted restoration. If you are kind of in that mid-successional, leaning towards late successional, just let it go. It's already on its trajectory. It just needs a little bit more time to get to the structural development of a late successional forest. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a minute. So you can have both perspectives working together in the park, where there are places that nature knows best. These mid-successional forests, they just need some loving and monitoring. You don't need to do anything in them, pretty much. Then you have these other places that look like that, dog hair, that might need some assisted restoration. So both truths existing in the same sphere of reality if we were to work together. Next slide. Oops, can you go backwards a minute? Forgot one other thing. If you look at those two vertical lines on the right, the distance in time to go from one to the other is only a couple of decades. Your forests are only a couple of decades away from having late successional characteristics, high integrity. Just let them go. It's not worth the amount of investments in restoration, and pulling trees out, and degradation costs, to just get them another 2 or 3 decades up that curve. But if you look all the way to the left on the early successional, it's going to take maybe 60 to 80 years to get them up that curve. That's what they might need some help with. Okay, next. Thanks. All right, So your mid-cirral forests are healthy forests. Everywhere I went yesterday looked healthy to me, and I specialize in this. I was straining my eyes to find any place that looked like it had a lot of tree kill. And in fact, what I wanted to see was more tree kill. That creates structure, snags, logs on the ground. So there's room for more tree kill, not less. I want to focus a little bit on natural disturbance ecology because that really determines whether a site has high integrity or not. Is it working the way nature designed? And the way nature designs your forest is your main disturbance dynamics are tree fall gaps inside a stand. A tree's going to die, a big mother tree eventually going to die. That opens up the canopy for light penetrance and to start that whole circular succession of pioneering organisms racing to the top, including the progeny of the tree that died. That's the majority of tree fall gap disturbances you get in coastal rainforests. You're in a coastal rainforest. Now, tree death is a natural process that in old growth forests will average 1 to 2% of the large trees will die every year as new large trees are coming into the canopy. That's natural. That's not unhealthy. Now, you also have landscape level disturbances. You'll get an occasional rare fire that will come through. We'll talk about that in a minute. And you'll get windstorms that will knock down large numbers of trees. That's your disturbance ecology. Your natural forests are supposed to be dense. It's a rainforest. We're not talking about frequent fire, dry forests that have a lot of spacing between trees. We're talking about a rainforest with a lot of biomass in it. That's natural. So let's focus a little bit on fires. They do occur occasionally on the peninsula, but with very large intervals between major fire events, anywhere from about a century to more, depending on how wet the forest is. Forest fires tend to be large, rare, and infrequent. And they're triggered by climate and lightning. So they're climate-limited fires. You'll get them on occasion when you've had successive drought, but again, you're in a rainforest. And so when you do get unusually hot, dry periods and east-flowing winds, you have conditions for fires, but it's very infrequent. It is changing from climate change. We'll talk a little bit about that too. But, you're not, in a system like this, you don't really want to think for fire concerns because it's not the way the forests were designed. They're not going to burn frequently. They're not going to be naturally open. They're dense coastal rainforests. Next. So nature has a fire insurance policy. Nature's fire insurance policy is many. And it mostly happens as trees get bigger and older. You might recall when you're walking around the forest, those large trees have dropped all their lower branches. It's hard for fire to get into the crowns when there aren't any lower branches. They've also thickened up their bark, and it's kind of a natural protection against most fires. In fact, the old forests tend to burn in low fire severities in the Pacific Northwest. That's been shown by many studies. So nature is building up fire resistance through aging its forests over time. Thick bark, moist microclimates, and a buffering against wind. The more trees you have in the forest stand, the more it acts as a buffer so you don't get winds pushing through the understory and then, fanning the flames so they get into the tree crown. So we want our forests to get older because that's fire insurance by nature. Next one. That guy on the left there, that's Richard Nixon. And he's hosing his house in a fire. You also notice that he has a wood shingle roof. Bad mixing, bad mixing. This is the best human fire insurance policy. Work on home hardening, work from the home out. There's numerous studies, including experimental evidence. The number one way for communities to survive forest fires is home hardening, defensible space, doing what you see on this slide. And I can speak from experience on this because I lost half of my town where I live in Southern Oregon in the Labor Day fire of 2020, which was a climate-driven fire event with a community that was spending millions of dollars logging in the backcountry, thinking that was fire prevention, when in fact what happened was almost 3,000 structures burned down in a single night because of ember cast. The embers were blowing sideways in 40-mile-an-hour winds, going from house to house like a domino effect. And within a single night, I lost half of my town because the community was unprepared. It wasn't doing home hardening, defensible space. It was relying on the Forest Service to thin in the backcountry, which did nothing to protect communities. So it really comes down to the home itself. Next slide. I want to return to this. When is thinning, which is used a lot as a restoration tool, restoration versus degradation. This is a paper that we have in the final stages of peer review. Again, it's another international paper. We kind of put it on this two-dimensional axis, but there's really more dimensions to this. I'll talk about that. But it is a function of the intensity of the thinning, the type of trees that are removed, and the scale of the operation, with the impacts increasing from left to right. So if you're thinning from below, you're taking small trees, you're doing prescribed burning, you're not going to have as much of a degradation effect, and you can actually have restoration outcomes. If you start plucking off large trees, and you rely on your road system, or you build roads and you turn, roads that are going back into the land, foresting into roads again, and you put out skid trails, you're increasing impacts. Left to right again, right? You see those arrows getting taller. You want to be way on the left side if you're doing restoration. You don't want to be on that right side of the figure. And again, we can measure this in the field. Next slide. All right, I promised you guys a Seahawks slide. You're getting it now. So I started to think, actually I really wasn't thinking, ChatGPT did it for me. How am I going to show this? Okay, so the county's talking about their prescriptions. Let's put the trees on the Seahawk field, as if they were growing there. On this side is a coastal rainforest that's naturally dense, packed into the Seahawk Stadium. 300 trees per acre, because a football field, minus the goalpost, is about an acre in size. Now, let's apply the county proposed prescriptions to that football field. This side, let's take out half the trees. Look at the difference. The problem with this, you are in a coastal rainforest, naturally dense, you're applying dry site thinning prescriptions. It doesn't make sense, because the forest is supposed to be naturally dense in those semi-natural, mid-successional forests that we talked about. You would not be doing restoration in those areas, yet that's the prescription that's being proposed. Next slide. And we saw this in the field. Now, this is not Banner, but this is Wiggs County Park, where the thinning was so extreme, and that's a drone slide there. And really, we tried to get above the canopy to give you kind of a sense of how much thinning was going on. But you really got to go out there and take a look at it for yourself, because it was shocking. It looked like that football field example, and that's going to elevate your impacts. Remember that two-dimensional slide that I showed you? Impacts go up. When you take out too many overstory trees, you overventilate the forest, meaning you have too much wind coming in, which is going to fan your fires, dry out your soils, and make the system more prone to fire. Then you've got soil damage, you've got invasive species, you've got fine fuels that are on the ground, you can't treat them all. You dried out that nice wet microclimate, and you lost the wind buffer. So you actually can make these forests more prone to fire by taking out too many of the overstory trees. And this is one of their prescriptions, at least in Wicks County. Okay, this one was a shocker. I have never seen Scotch broom grown like this before. And this was one of the sites we visited that you can see on this side when the park was first acquired. Then they went and did a thinning operation. This is pretty close, but not exactly the same location. And that was the response. So look how tall that Scotch broom is. They did a great job growing Scotch broom, but not in restoring the forest. In fact, this is extreme degradation. And it really is shocking how much, and I don't know how you deal with that. It was everywhere where we were walking yesterday. Next slide. Okay, so I'm getting close to wrapping up, and then we're going to take questions. I want to have a lot of time for questions, but this is where I think the two perspectives can come together. Just stay out of the semi-natural areas, those mid-successional stands, and let's talk about what to do with the young log stands that look like this, because there are 93 acres it is on the banner. What if you did nothing? Just let them be, right? That's one outcome. It'll take about 60, 80 years before those stands self-thin and start to open up, develop structure, have stands, have large trees on the ground, have plant diversity in the understory, like Scotch broom. If you just let them be, right? That's one option. The other option is, let's speed it up. Let's leapfrog and reduce the time interval on that little graph that I showed you of increasing structural complexity. We could do that by thinning out some of the competing stems, and that would increase the growth rate of the remaining trees. This is a forestry approach that's been used throughout the Pacific Northwest. That's an option too. You could set a limit on it, and the county had less than, they wouldn't take any trees that were greater than 24 inches diameter breast height, but I didn't see a lot of trees out there that were greater than 24 inches. Maybe that diameter needs to be set at 9 inches, because that really corresponds to what I was seeing yesterday in these densely grown stands. So you could set your diameter limits much lower than what they were talking about. This is more of a surgical operation than a broadcast operation. Start slow, do some monitoring, see what the responses are, have controls, have treatment areas, and no heavy equipment. There's no need for heavy machinery if you're going after trees that are 9 inches or less in diameter. You can do a lot of hand sawing on chainsaws at the local level without heavy machinery, which would cause all kinds of soil compaction problems. There's no commercial value in those trees, so you're going to have to get creative about how you fund it, and you can use the existing trails with no road upgrades. So that might be one alternative. It's just what I noticed when I was kind of trying to cue in on, yeah, those young stands, they look pretty bad, and they're all Doug fir. And the site index in those areas would indicate you can have more than Doug fir in those areas. You could have cedar mixing in with the Doug fir. You could have spruce, hemlock, and I wasn't seeing that. So that might be an area for taking out, lowering those Doug fir densities and planting, assisted planting with cedar, with hemlock, with the missing elements in those forests. So that's where assisted restoration could work. Yes. Okay, so back to the Seahawks. How do you thin these forests? On this side, my right, looking at the screen, is the typical thinning grid pattern. They tend to grid thin on 8 to 10 feet spacing intervals between trees. On this side is sloppy thinning, where you thin in starts and stops, starts and stops. You create a sloppy thinning operation where you have clusters of trees that weren't thinned and areas spaces where there was thinning. That might give you more heterogeneity, lower the impacts, and allow the stand to kind of have both dense areas and treated areas. And that might be an experimental design to see how things are responding than using the traditional kind of trees grown like corn that just is not restoration. Next slide. Okay, I mentioned earlier that we can assess thinning impacts by intensity of operation, types of trees removed, and scale of the operation, and context. And I didn't talk about context. So I'm going to talk about context now. Context really matters. So you see those purple areas on that slide, that diagram to the left, looking at the screen again. Those are areas that are proposed for thinning in your park. And they're juxtaposed with private areas, some of which have a lot of Scotch broom problems. And the places that have Scotch broom are the source material, the seed banks for Scotch broom to propagate. Scotch broom loves the sunlight. So the more you thin an area, the more you've created Scotch broom habitat. Juxtaposition context means if there is a Scotch broom outbreak outside the park, along that boundary where you're thinning, you're going to have Scotch broom very quickly in those thin stands. Context matters. Keeping Scotch broom out of the park is a #1 priority. Then what do you do with the fuels when you've done thinning? That's a tricky one because you don't want to raise your fire problems. You can do lob and scatter. You can kind of just masticate those. Get a machine out there that's low impact. You don't want to do any damage to the soil. And get those ground up into fine materials like bark chips and scatter them back on the forest floor. That might be one way to deal with the residue so you don't raise your fuel problems. Next. Okay, what about these mid-zero forests? I just think they need to be loved. I was out there hugging a bunch of big trees yesterday. That's all they need. They don't need to do anything else. And they just need a little time. They're on that trajectory to late zero. They just need maybe 2 or 3 decades and they'll be there on their own, and it really is not worth the restoration cost and financing and the impact cost in what it would do to the soils and having the logging machinery. It's not worth it to leapfrog a couple of decades when it's going to happen anyhow. There may be some situations where you could create some canopy gaps to kill some trees to give you some snags, which would open up the light, open up the canopy for light into the forest floor. Then maybe you can plant with cedar, with white pine on the dry sides, with hemlock to give you more of a mix because it's mostly Doug fir out there. There's some cedar in the wetter areas, but you could reintroduce some of the native species that should be out there. And killing some of the trees and creating snags, and then those snags will eventually become logs on the ground, which will be nurse logs that are needed in there as well. There's no need for roads. There's no need for heavy equipment. There's no need to go back in and clear these roads that are already revegetating or becoming trails. Just let that be. And here's the kicker too. I think this is a place where everyone can work together. What the heck does heritage mean? The park is named the Heritage Park, but what does that mean? Why not do a heritage inventory? You know, get out there and it's okay, this is a large tree, that's heritage. This is a favorite mushroom picking place, that's heritage. This is a place where I see a lot of birds that are queuing in on diversity of forest, heritage. We need kind of a checklist and a definition of what heritage is and ways to manage that forest for its heritage foundation. Scotch broom is not a heritage, but it's heading in that direction, unfortunately, in some places. Yes. I found all kinds of critters out there yesterday, including this white dove that greeted me, or whatever that is. So anyway, I'm kind of wrapping this up. I guess this is my closing slide. Trying to bring it all together here, that I have a very depressing job. I've been doing this for 45 years now, watching the world's forests shrink before my very eyes. But I also am optimistic because of what I see in communities like yours. And that's a good thing, because the more I see that happening, the more I think global and I see you acting local, it gives me hope. I think what we have here is a failure to communicate. And you guys both need marriage counseling. The county and the community need to come together somehow, even though you may have different perspectives in terms of what the truth is. Working together is the best way to solve that, and the community can work with the county on an inventory of heritage elements that you guys want protected and they want restored, and see if you can come to terms with that. I already said the mid-zero stage of the forest, that's a heritage element. It's been there for, I don't know, 50, 60 years. It's fine, it's heritage. Can you come to an agreement on assisted restoration with no heavy equipment in those areas? Opening stands, probably not a good idea if you're near a Scotch broom seed bank. We've seen in that one example, it's now a Scotch broom whatever, I would call it a forest. More collaborative stewarding of the park and monitoring would be a way to work together. And then you got to figure out how to finance it, because true ecological restoration doesn't pencil out. And sprinkling in large trees to pay for it is just degradation. And I can kind of feel the push-pull that the county is experiencing, where they want to do something, but they don't have the funding to do it. But in some cases, doing nothing may be the best way to restore an area. And in other cases, it may be working with volunteers in creative ways to get the job done that might be able to get it done without having it to pencil out. I think that was my last slide. There's one more. And my hat's off to the county as well. I think from what I read, they've got some pretty noble vision statements in their documents. They're trying to do the right thing. From my discussions with them, I didn't detect an apparent commercial logging agenda, although they are taking some large trees that would have commercial value, and that's a red flag for me. There's a lot of great language in their forest plan. Both the county and the community loves the same area, but if you can put on the glasses and see the same color, maybe you have a chance to come together and work this out. The heritage elements are really the foundation here. Everything should be set in terms of goals around what those heritage elements are. And I struggled with trying to find it in the documents. Maybe it's there, and again, I only had a few days to kind of look at this. Maybe you guys know what it is. Stewardship group, I know it exists. It'd be a great idea to have it out there and have it elected leaders with equal representation across the groups. I think it's the best way to go. I've seen that work effectively in other situations where you have equal weight in all the decisions, depending on what your interests are. I think a cost-benefit analysis needs to be done on whatever they're wanting to do, including no action in places like the net zero forest, and alternatives like what we talked about in the young forests that don't involve heavy machinery. How are you going to pay for that? Is it really worth leapfrogging in young stands that are 20 or 30 years old? I think it is, but you're not talking about removing any big trees. So how do you do that without a commercial logging aspect? And lastly, I want to thank both the county and the Friends of Banner Forest for bringing me out here today. The one positive I'm taking away is, again, I have a very depressing job at times, but when I come to communities like this and I see the outpouring of love of the place, it makes me feel like, yeah, there is hope in the world. So you guys deserve the ovation for what you've been doing to love this place for so many years. And thanks again for bringing me out. Okay, I hope I could see everybody as asking questions. So raise your hand, the mics are up here too. I think there's going to be someone that will run around, and that's probably the best way to do it. Can someone take the mics around?
Or just line up.
They have to read.
Just line up here.
Thanks, Terry. I think you had your hand up first, so come on up. Come on down.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm Lori. You were referring to this area as a rainforest. I didn't know that. I'm thinking the whole rainforest that we have, but we are actually a rainforest.
Yeah, you are. In fact, in 2011, I wrote the book Temperate and Boreal Rainforest of the World. And you guys live in what's called the North Pacific Coastal Rainforest. And it's in different subclimatic zones. So the southern extent of the North Pacific Coastal Rainforest is the Coast Redwoods. It's the warmer part of the bioregion. And you move up the coast, and you come into the peninsula where you are now. You're still in coastal rainforest. You're more in a transitional zone where you get a little warmer summers, but you're still considered coastal rainforest. Go further north into British Columbia, into southeast Alaska, along the Kodiak Island where it peters out. It's all part of the same bioregion. There are differences in climate at the sub-regional level across that large area, but you're all part of the same bioregion.
Thanks for clearing that up.
I might also say that if you're on the Olympic Peninsula and you're in Sequim, you're in a rain shadow. So there's variability in there too. That's a stretch if I've ever seen one.
I really appreciate you coming out and giving us your support. In 2021, we had an event called a heat dome, where we had multiple days of, well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Did you see any damage or any effect from that heat dome event?
Wow, what a great question. So in 2021, during the heat dome, I brought a team of news reporters up to the Tongass Rainforest that were doing a cover story on what is the value of an old growth tree. And it was a fascinating trip because I left Southern Oregon at the time, it was 121 degrees. And I went to Prince of Wales Island where I had been studying that rainforest for over 30 years. We took them out on some of my forest plots. And it was 84 degrees in southeast Alaska. And in the summertime, in July, it's supposed to be in the 50s. And really was amazing how hot it was. I actually was the first reported tick bite in Alaska. I got it. I had to go to the hospital, report it, sign out a bunch of paperwork because they never had ticks before. And the thing is, I had been doing all these climate studies projecting that the coastal rainforest would be able to handle climate change much better than the interior areas, like interior Alaska, the inland forest of the Pacific Northwest, where it's going to heat up more, fires are going to be more prevalent. That's what all my models were telling me, projecting forward in time. But then when I went up there and I saw what was going on, and I'm looking at it biodiversity, but the native community up there is saying, I don't have any fish on my table. I don't have any deer in my storage because it's so overheated. The fish aren't running, the deer aren't coming in, so we're really feeling the heat, literally. And it made me think about the more we put emissions into the atmosphere, the more these forests are going to change, and the bigger the impacts are going to be to us. So that's what I saw in Alaska. Now, in terms of what's going on in the Pacific Northwest, there has been increased tree stress from hotter temperatures and drought conditions, and they're affecting the big trees. And there's going to be dieback, and that dieback is going to increase depending on how many more heat domes we get. And unfortunately, if we continue to remain on the emissions trajectory that we currently are, there are going to be more of those. And that really worries me because I'm a granddad, and I've got 4 grandkids that are coming into this. And I look at these models, what they're projecting by the time my 8-year-old grandson and granddaughter are my age, it worries me. So the best way to deal with that is to cut our emissions. The best way to deal with that is to protect these special places that can act as climate refugia, which is part of that stewardship plan. We saw the language, refugia. It doesn't mean those forests aren't going to die back, but we're certainly going to speed it up, the dieback, if we log those areas. So we've got to do 2 things. We've got to cut our emissions and we've got to save our forests. That's the best way to get through this climate change virus. Anybody on this side of the room? Terry's getting her exercise today.
Yeah, thank you for coming as well. You said you talked to the county and probably the authors of the management plan and got their vision. And what I was wondering was, a lot of these forests throughout the county and the nation, they are managed according to the plan. And these visions for what the future conditions will be has been documented years ago. So in the case of Banner Forest, I think the management plan outlined what the vision is, what the future conditions are, and I imagine it included some level of thinning because the land was DNR property. It was managed as a source of income for schools, and it was stocked accordingly, it was planted accordingly in the beginning at a certain density.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering about is that density wise to continue from an overstock condition to let nature take over from there? Or did the county somehow fail to manage, or are they not doing what they claim they're going to be doing? Because I'm concerned that if the plan is implemented, it has a desired condition that's there, but if we suddenly stop and not manage the plan and come up with another plan, are we taking some kind of risk as well, and then especially with fire? Because you can argue that Banner Forest has an elevated risk level for that parameter, and if we do nothing, are the people in this room willing to do nothing if a fire breaks out? If an unnatural event in Banner Forest occurs and it's exacerbated because of the overstocking, are people willing to say, do nothing, let nature take its course? If we do that, we'll have no forest at all, and we'll have to start nature over again, and that will take centuries. So the cycle of forest fires is there. It's infrequent, but it's devastating. And as you know, the forest management philosophy of the country was ill-guided for many decades, and now we're overstocked with an elevated risk of understory growth. So it seems to me there's a happy balance between do nothing and clear cut or overthink. So I think there is a need to address some prescriptive measures in Banner Forest, because I don't think we want to do nothing forever.
So my perspective on it is there's a couple of things. First of all, I think there's some room for overlap of concentric circles. Okay, and that area of overlap is what we should look for. And so those young stands that I mentioned, the 93 acres, that's the place to do experimentation. Those mid-cereal stages, no. I mean, they're on their way to natural fire resistance. The trees are getting older, they're getting more fire resistant, they're getting larger, they're dropping those lower branches. They're not the fire problem. The fire problem happens when you have densely packed small trees, or you have slash on the ground, or you have an overventilated situation. Those are the things to avoid. If you can develop management prescriptions that avoid those things, then you can lower fire risk. However, in the situation with the Olympic Peninsula, your fires are climate limited more than they are fuel limited. That means that the climate is really going to determine when and what type of fires you get. Fuels are a secondary factor in these wet forests. They're going to burn when you have a drought cycle, when you have a lightning strike or a humid ignition, and when you have excessive drying. And so you don't want to amplify those things by over-thinning the forest, by making it more prone to wind penetrance, drying out the understory, and reducing stem densities. This is a coastal rainforest. It's supposed to be naturally dense. However, because it was logged previously, because it was mostly Doug fir that was planted back or seeded on its own, I don't know the forestry practices here, you do have a stocking problem in those young stands. So those are the places where I think you could do some experimental management. Now, as far as communities and the risk of fire, as I mentioned earlier, the best way to do that is home hardening defensible space. That is proven science. There's a Forest Service retiree now, Jack Cohen, has done a lot of work on this. He actually set up experimental sites where he would have a flame blower shooting embers at two structures, one hardened, one not hardened, and just shooting embers at it, which is what happens in these big fires. Guess which one burned down? The one that wasn't hardened. And the way you harden homes is you screen vents, any open vents, you make sure you don't have a wood-shaped roof. You use extra pane glass on your windows. You don't have wood shingles or wood siding, maybe use hardy board. There's so many different ways to harden homes, and you do defensible space within a 50 to 60-foot radius around the home. You make sure you have no vegetation touching the structure. That's your best fire policy to reduce fires spilling over. Now, the studies that have been done in Oregon were interesting too. They showed the major problem with spillover from wildland fires were coming from log areas. And we've looked at this research for in many publications now. And the unique thing about it is, the cool thing about my job is I get to work at a global scale. And when we see things that are being repeated in different regions of the world, that's a big thing in ecology. And I'm going to tell you what we're seeing globally that's a repeating trend regarding fire. We now know through climate science, climate attribute models, what are the main drivers of these fast fires. The main drivers are related to climate change, but we can pull that out and say that within the umbrella of climate change, what's going to give you fire activity is the vapor pressure deficit. The amount of moisture in the atmosphere. The drier the moisture is, the more likely of a fire event. Put on top of that the heat dome that gentleman raised earlier. That's going to give you the conditions. Early snow melt will also prime the fire pump. That's one set of variables. The other set of variables include how much logging happens on the landscape. So logging and extreme fire weather interact to push out these big fires. We've seen it now in western United States, western Canada, the boreal forest in Quebec and Ontario, in western Europe and southeast Australia. That's a big deal. All of those areas have big fires. All of those areas have the same response variables. And so you can do some thinning, but when you have a climate-limited system, it's gonna move through a forest because you have high winds, drought, and extreme temperature all driving those fires quick and furious. And when they encounter a log landscape with slashed young trees tightly packed, it's just adding the fuel to the mix. And Scotch broom. Yeah, that doesn't mean we can't prepare. We can prepare. We can take advantage of our forests getting older and more fire risks reduced, and we can prepare from our home out. That's the best way to deal with the fire issues.
Howdy. Thank you, Dr. Del Sala, for being here. So I hope I can articulate it well enough. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yeah, better? Okay. So I think we can agree that biodiversity is really important. And as I understand, the land was logged regularly as part of the DNR's management. From what I saw, and obviously you might have seen differently, tell me, is that there's a lot of Doug fir, even in the healthier areas. And so my question is, would you say that's appropriate even in the mid-process of, you're mentioning it's not linear, it's circular, we're kind of in the middle of the process for the healthier stands. Would you say it's appropriate to cut or kill some of the Doug fir that's in there? And when I say cut, I mean like cut and leave for nurse logs, and kill maybe girdle or something else, leave it for snags. The reason I ask is because my impression that while it might take 20 to 30 years for that stand to reach maturity, it will take even longer for other native species to create biodiversity. So can you speak to that? I've got another question, Paul.
Yeah, you bet. What a great question. And if I didn't mention that in my talk, I should have. One of the things I noted that was missing from those mid-cereal stages was exactly what you're talking about. And I think you could do that kind of creative management. It's not forestry per se, where you're dragging logs out, you've got heavy equipment in it, but you're maybe girdling some trees and then planting in the gap. And missing components, I kept looking for cedar, I kept looking for spruce, I kept looking for, the other diversity of tree species in the dry sites, the pine, there was some silver fir out there, but it was, and hemlock, it was missing those components. And I thought, okay, I know why it's missing, because they planted with Doug fir, or they allowed the Doug fir to come in because that was a commercially valuable species. So one thing you can do is get out on the ground, determine what the site index is, what potential vegetation association is under unlogged conditions, and then what's missing from the heritage owners. So now you focus on the heritage. Okay, we know in this stand, it's a wet site, we should have more hemlock, we should have more cedar. We don't have enough stands. So that would be appropriate way to handle. To me, that's true ecological restoration. And those are the places, those mid-zero stages that would benefit from it.
Thank you for that. The reason why, well, let me just start by appreciating that I think that active management again, context and all the other things you mentioned make a difference on how and when and whether to actively manage. I think that that just intuitively feels right. But also, so just to follow up on the how for cutting and killing, particularly the killing, what would you say is the best method? Because there's chemical methods, there's girdling, which is my understanding is you take like a wire or something and you wrap it around it, it'll go and kill eventually. What are some of the best methods? Yeah.
I don't know. That's for the foresters to figure
Okay.
out. But I mean, there are a lot of ways you can inject with fungus that's not going to spread. You could girdle with a chainsaw around the circumference of the tree. You could blow the tops off of some of these too. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. It's just this is creative forestry.
Yeah, like hand selected and minimal expense for the county of noise.
Yeah, and the most important part is to involve people in this so you know why it's being done, right? If you remove the commercial element and you get into creative forestry restoration, I think you'll see a lot of support increase from the public, and maybe this is the place where the county and the public can work together, but it's hard to do because it doesn't pencil out. So you got to find a way to fund it.
My name's Steve. Thank you very much for being here. We had a chance to be out with the forester a few months back, and he talked about natural reforestation as opposed to planting. And so I was wondering about what you thought about that. The other question I had was, he had talked about the compacting of the soil, and he mentioned these certain machines that would roll in on rubber tires and come out and cut at low spots the smaller trees. He was always talking about smaller trees as opposed to larger trees. How has that worked in forest restoration? And thank you.
Yeah, you bet, Steve. The first part of your question about natural versus assisted planting, it really depends on your seed source. Like, in a lot of places that I've been in the Pacific Northwest where there's a large fire, right after that large severe fire, usually within a year there's a seed rain, that we call it. And so, especially if there are live seed sources nearby, so you could just have natural regeneration in those natural disturbance events. But from what I saw in those mid-zero stages, and it gets back to his earlier question, wherever you are, Nick, that there could be places where you want to do some assisted planting to speed it up a bit, because what I was observing was, okay, what's missing here? That it's not really at the top of that kind of curve to late successional. What's missing is the dead tree component and the trees that are stands and logs that are nurse logs, and the cedar, the hemlock, and on the dry sites, exposed mills, the white pine. That's where you can do some creative forestry, where you're killing some of the Doug fir and you're planting in those gaps. And it depends on light levels, and I know foresters can figure this out. Site potential, site index, wet, dry, all of that is known from potential vegetation associations and site index. They can get out there and figure out where are the best sites to do this. Get the mic in there.
Those non-invasive tree farms.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not a forester. I've been on the ground with foresters, so I don't know. You could, maybe if it's less impactful, you could also get some horses back there and do it that way. You go out there and horse around.
Hi, my name is Paige, and I have a question to talk to all of you.
Closer to your mouth, please.
You talked a lot about
Thank you.
compromise
and working with the other side. So it seems like there's been a lot of conflict between groups that want to save and preserve areas of this earth versus a different perspective. And a lot of it's revenue driven. I can see that we meet with that build homes or do whatever. I mean, there are costs to living. Has there been anything that has helped generate revenue by leaving a forest? In our county, we have a budget deficit of $7-8 million, and one of the county sites stated that they didn't even have the funds to pay the bills for 2026. Between all of our parks, that is significant revenue, not only to cover the cost of restorative living, whatever you want to call it. I am for just leaving it be, but I think most people know my position on that. But I do feel that there is that type of compromise that can be built if we can come together as a community and say, hey, what are some revenue streams that we can keep our forests intact, keep the things that we want out of it, but still be able to enrich our own community? Is there anything in a global scale that's been able to do this and give us ideas that we could use?
Yeah, so true ecological restoration doesn't pencil out because you aren't doing a commercial logging operation. You're in a park, right? This isn't like an industrial forestry operation where it has to pencil out. So you got to get creative. So one thing that I've worked in the past on is the carbon registry. And just to your south, the Elliott State Forest has gone through carbon accounting, and they've used carbon to finance a lot of their conservation and management in that system. I've been involved in a few of these operations. They're not going to save the climate, but they could provide some opportunity for leveling the economic playing field for conservation. So the way it works is you have a forest plan, and your forest plan says, we want to do a little commercial logging here, we want to do some restoration here, we want to do some protection here, we want to do all of these things. And the commercial operation is logging, it's going to be impactful. How can we do everything we want to do without logging the site? So you'll have an independent team of carbon folks come in and say, we're going to look at your forest plan, and we're going to look at, here's what it would be if all you did was what you wanted to do. You're going to have a logging situation, you're going to generate some revenue from those trees, or instead of logging, you're not going to log the forest. And that's called additionality, because now you're banking carbon in the system instead of removing it. That can then be converted into carbon per acre per dollar. So you've saved X amount of carbon per acre, carbon measured in units, has a financial value to it because it's additional carbon being banked over time. That then has money associated with it. Now the next step is after you've gone through that verification process, and you're not going to log when you said you were going to log, and you're going to accrue additionality, you have to find a buyer. Someone that is willing to pay for the carbon that's accruing in the forest to offset some of their emissions. Under the state of California, they have the Global Climate Change Act, and they allow for these kinds of carbon exchanges to take place to offset up to 8% of the emissions from a carbon polluter. So somebody like Microsoft can say, we need to offset 8% of our emissions. Let's talk to you guys about doing a carbon offset where we pay the forest to grow carbon. That might be one thing to look at.
I was kind of thinking more the lines of a job, per se. Something that our community can do physically, whether it be, my background is in mental health, So I've always, the forest is always great for somebody's mental health, whether it be, forest therapy or whatnot. But like something that our community can do, that he can do, that she can do, that I can do. I appreciate the carbon statements. It's a little bit over my head, and I know it's not going to impact my wallet, but it's going to impact my walk in the morning, and the one that I'm about to go on before it goes dark. So forgive me for early exit. But that's something that our community can do to generate revenue for our county to make our town better. Like a job, a mental health job. Has the global community found any compromises on that regard?
Yeah, so I'm thinking if you're not a member of the Friends group, you probably should be. Because those guys and gals may know better about how to answer that at the local level. What sort of jobs can you generate that aren't, pulling material out of the forest that support the community? I mean, it needs to happen. It needs to be recreation focused.
I'm actually going to get cracked about that. I think you know what kind but our community.
Use the mic. I can't hear you. Sorry.
I do know what's happening at the local level. I do talk to my community members. But we're looking for outside ideas. We want to save them for us. But there are things that people would like to be able to do something rather than just talk about it.
Yeah.
The carbon things, we have no control over that. Here in Port Orchard, Kitsap County, Hallsville, Cambridge, we don't have any control over that. But we do have control over, hey, we're going to the commissioners meeting and, we're still like $6 billion over budget. And you want to block. We need something more immediate. And those are the ideas I was trying to see if the global scale had any feedback for communities like ours that we can really make an impact in our own community right now. Not 10 years, not a year from now.
You stumped the chump.
Sorry.
Hi, my name's Andy. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, you talked about forest health in terms of reference sites. And you also talked about the kind of circular or chaotic nature of succession. So what's the process of selecting a reference site when there can be so many normal conditions as that chaotic succession proceeds?
Yeah, so we had in our 2025 publication a checklist of all kinds of variables. There was 2 pages in this one table of all these different components that relate to criteria, to principles, to indicators, to verifiers. You take that checklist out in the field, and you go to a site that there's going to be some subjectivity on this. That looks like a site based on this long list of tables that has high ecological integrity for that particular stand type on that particular site. That becomes your reference site. I mean, the county's talking about backcasting to historical conditions, but that's really hard to do. It's a guidepost. You need to know what it is, but we're not in a historical climate anymore. So that's why I keep coming back to go find your reference site based on site potential in that area and compare it to an equivalent site with the same site potential in terms of how you're moving the forest in whatever direction you want to move. So it needs to be done on a site-by-site basis. I think we have time for one more question because I'm seeing people want to get out there before it's dark.
But I have 10 questions. Sorry. As far as we need all of us to shift our focus from making our forests be revenue generators and think of them as value in an ecological sense, what they do for us, especially here in Kitsap County, because if we didn't have forests, we would have more depleted watersheds. The only water what replenishes our aquifers is rainwater. That's one comment. If we view our forests as a source of education, get our students out there, do some real experimentation in our forests, figure out, as you're saying, about what works. Set up what you think is a healthy forest, and then compare what happens elsewhere. We have a huge diversity of basically forests that are recovering plantations. This comes to my last point. When you talk to the county, please ask them about Port Gamble Forest, so-called Heritage Park. The uplands of that park have been clear-cut. It is actively being clear-cut as we speak. The uplands are covered with Scotch broom over my head, interspersed with huge slash pines. Is this not a recipe for fire? I think about it all the time when I'm walking up there. So that's my lesson. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And, maybe you guys, or they, the friends group elsewhere need to bring me back next time so I can see that. Because I know that I mentioned early on that the county has about 13 of the 75 sites that are forested that are being looked at. I've only seen banners, so I know their plans are more ambitious, and it would be good to work with some of the other groups that have similar concerns that you guys have, and to see if this can be done in a collection of areas that they're looking at treating, and that's a good point.
I wish I could speak like that, so I'm going to stand like this. Anyway, that's going to conclude. It's 4 o'clock now, and we're starting to lose people. I think they're getting hungry or something. I am. But anyway, we really appreciate everybody showing up today, and I hope you realize we've done a lot of hard work. There's a lot more work to be done, but I want to personally thank Dr. Dallas for coming up and taking the time to hopefully get some time and we work with the county to make this happen. So thanks you again for showing up, and have a good evening. Be safe. Get home.